Welcome, everyone. I'm Andreas Lang. I'm course leader in MA Architecture, and I welcome you very much to the evening lecture series Fundamentals, hosted by the Spatial Practice Program. It's a 3 series. You can see it's the first one kicking off the debate around climate. It follows on quite a lot of initiatives that are taking place in CSM itself. We had 2 climate assemblies, bringing the whole school together, kind of being proactively thinking what we should do and how we should address the crisis. It's building on an exhibition in the Leatherby Gallery earlier this year, Designing in Turbulent Times, really looking at the students' work, how we design against, for, with the climate through our work, through the work we produce, but also kind of builds on students' initiatives such as Architecture Education Declares. So the aim for us is really to, on the one hand, educate ourselves, but also kind of mobilize us into action. And very much looking forward to the 3 series to help us do that. One sad news is that, sadly, Paloma Gormley is ill, so we are down to 3 panelists and 1 chair. A few housekeeping rules. There's no fire drill planned, so if you hear anything, it is serious. And make yourself out here and to the front of the building. And if you go out here after the lecture to the left, you will run into the Work in Progress show, which you're all very welcome to attend. And if you go even further, you will hit the bar, which is where we will all convene over a pint after this. Let me look at my notes. I think I don't have to say much more other than to welcome our panelists, but also Tom Dyckhoff, writer, historian and broadcaster, and also probably the only teacher on the Spatial Practices course that both teaches in the BA and the MA. So I think you know nearly every student on our course. So I hand over, and thank you all for coming, and thank you, Tom, for chairing tonight.
Thank you, Andreas. Here are the facts, the bold facts. That bombshell report from the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change just 15 months ago. It feels like a lifetime ago, 15 months ago. Recommended with the utmost urgency that we needed to halve carbon emissions by 2030 if we are to have any chance of keeping global temperature rises to within 1.5 degrees. Currently, the way we're going at the moment, we'll be very lucky to keep global temperature rises in the 3 to 4 degree centigrade range, and that would be devastating for everything, for life as we know it on the planet. And those are conservative estimates. I remember chatting to somebody from the IPCC who sort of whispered to me that actually what the IPCC presents is a pretty conservative estimate. It's a pretty conservative one because it has to have the agreement of people from all around the world. And that got me very worried indeed. The UK at the moment is on target to miss its carbon emissions reductions targets for 2025 and 2030. At the moment, its plans kind of predate the IPCC report. It wants to become net zero carbon by 2050. That's, of course, 20 years too late for the IPCC. And then we come to the built environment industry. Around the world, estimates vary, but about 40 to 47% of global carbon emissions come from everybody involved in the built environment industry, though not people like me. Actually, architectural historians have a very low carbon footprint. However, in the UK alone, the built environment industry, from everybody from architects to builders to developers, we produce 1/3 of the UK's waste, 1/3 of the UK's waste, and we use 60% of the UK's materials, 60% of everything. It's kind of astonishing. So the climate emergency, as we all know, we're all completely aware over the last 15 months since that report, has shot up the agenda to the very top. And they were already in a period, an era of multiple crises. So this has become the most dominant of multiple crises, from nuclear proliferation to the housing crisis. I mean, we could go on and get extremely depressed. We know that architecture and the built environment industry is right at the heart of the problem, and obviously, potentially, as a consequence, a solution as well. We also know, though, that continuing this list of facts, we know that the built environment industry, the construction industry, is incredibly conservative. It's incredibly resistant to change. So we have to enact radical change very quickly, within 10 years, in an industry which is resistant to change. And, of course, human beings everywhere, generally, are kind of resistant to change. We don't like to change quickly and radically unless we're compelled to or incentivized to. So how are we going to change? How are we going to change within this industry? It seems almost insurmountable, and perhaps we'll talk later on about the kind of the paralysis that maybe is affecting so many people when faced with this deluge of facts and depressing prospects. How can we maintain that optimism? As I'm sure you're completely aware, institutions like Central St. Martin's, everywhere from the BBC to Central St. Martin's, all over the world are now galvanized because of the IPCC report. And we all have to go on a massive education program. We all have to learn how to do things differently. How we are going to do things differently, that's the key thing. Here we're beginning at CSM our own re-education program. It's going to be the start of a very rapid, hopefully, and deep and fundamental change in what we teach, what we do, what kind of architecture, what kind of built environment we have. So for us, we've already started. We've already had climate assemblies. In spatial practices, we're beginning to think about how we change what we teach. Here at Fundamentals, this is the fourth in the series. Previous ones have looked at beauty, at the construction industry, at how architects work. This one is the most pressing of all, of course. Fundamental to everything, literally fundamental to everything that we're going to do. Do we need a paradigm shift, a massive shift in everything and every way in which we produce buildings in the built environment? This week we're going to begin small. Well, pretty big, the building. In 2 weeks' time, we'll expand our view out to the city, to the neighborhood, to the landscape. And then finally, in a month's time, 4 weeks' time, we'll be looking at whether we have to change the way we do things, the way we practice, the way we think, our philosophies as well. Normally, fundamentals is very controversial, full of debate and adversarial fighting and shaking of fists. We'll have a bit of that, maybe, I don't know. But I think the nature of the climate emergency means that we have to pull together. There has to be a cooperation, more than competition, more than that adversarial climate behind so many debates. So I'm hoping that there'll be a spirit of generosity and cooperation here in the room tonight and among our panelists as well as a bit of lively debate. So our panelists, we have Audeline Doulière, who is an architect, who researches flows of materials and the reuse of materials. She worked at David Chipperfield's office and also with the amazing, I don't know if anyone knows it, but the amazing Belgian practice of Rotor, who pioneer methods of reusing building materials. Absolutely fantastic organization, if you can get a chance to look at what they do. She now teaches at the Architectural Association, and in 2018 was a recipient of the Harvard Wheelwright Prize for her current research. We have Michael Paulin, who worked for 10 years at Grimshaw Architects, central to the team behind that amazing space in Cornwall, the Eden Project. Amazing bubble wrap biomes, absolutely fantastic. If you haven't been there, you must go there. But a real pioneering building in energy use and efficiency of materials. In 2007, he set up his own practice and organization, Exploration Architecture, to advocate biomimicry in design, so learning from nature, but also regenerative design, which I hope he's going to talk a little bit about this evening. And he's one of thousands of architects who last year signed the Architects Declare initiative as well. And finally, we have Joe Gidding, who is co-founder of the Architects Climate Action Network, which was formed last year in response to the climate emergency and the IPCC report to advocate for complete, rapid, and radical change in the built environment industry. He is advocating for massive change, and we'll maybe get a chance to hear a little bit more about what that actually entails. As Andreas said, I'm afraid Pillow McGormley is unwell and was unable to be here. Each will present, though, a provocation, and then I'll invite them all up here on the stage to have a discussion with me, and then we'll open up the conversation to all of you folks as well, so get your questions ready. So for now, let me invite up onto the stage Joe.
Thanks, Tom. I was actually going to start with a bit about the IPCC report, but seeing as you've done that already, maybe I'll kind of skip over that. So we're faced with an existential dilemma, I think. We're confronted with a body of scientific work that Tom pointed out that is really meticulously calculated, and it tells us exactly how much more CO2 we can emit before we pass that threshold, that 1.5 degree threshold. That is the report that came out 2 years ago, which spurred us into action. Now we're at 1 degree of warming already, and it looks like this. The consequences are catastrophic. And the report explains that with another half a degree, these kind of events will become more intense and more frequent. Also looks like this. So 2 years ago, they gave us until 2030 to halve emissions. But if any of you are paying attention to what she says, we actually now have more like until 2028, and that's because we've already used up a fair bit of our budget. So that's because we haven't really done anything yet. And this is the year that we really have to start changing things. This is the year that emissions have to peak. So we've got to think long and hard about whether we seriously want to deal with this or whether we're happy just keeping our blinkers on, choosing to ignore the alarm bells and tacitly accepting things getting much, much worse. Okay, so that's my slice of doom over, because it's not really much fun for anyone, is it? So what does this mean for the way that we build? I'm going to focus on the carbon burp, as it's quite amusingly called, which is the large amount of carbon emitted at the beginning of a building's life cycle. I think that's the most important because our emergency is now. And I think that means that we have to do 5 things. The first is plant-based architecture, buildings as carbon stores. We are gaining a better understanding of what exactly it is that we're doing wrong, and surprise, surprise, it's our use of these materials over materials like these. That is materials that involve a lot of extraction and heavy processing over ones that grow from the ground or the ground itself. So I wasn't going to include this because it's one of Paloma's projects, but after seeing as she pulled out, I thought I'd get this in there because it's great. This is the hemp house that Practice Architecture did. And so I think we need to adopt a primarily plant-based architecture in the same way that we're adopting plant-based diets and clothing and products. So we turn our buildings into carbon stores, and through enough use of plant-based matter, we can justify the use where necessary of materials like concrete and glass. And that leads into more exciting things, I think, for the architect, which that project demonstrates quite well. The second thing is land stewardship. So this would be like active sequestration through our design. It would open up new responsibilities for the architect and the design team more widely through the use of, if we're going to use plant-based matter, it's going to be most effective if it's intertwined with a close relationship to the land. So why are experts in forestry not part of the design team at the moment? Why not bring them into the design team? The third thing is circularity, and we all know what this means now. We've heard it a lot. It's becoming maybe overused, but I think that's important. Reuse of buildings, reuse of building materials, and of the content inside materials. So a timber frame to a timber frame, eventually when that's not acceptable to be used as structure anymore. You can use it as chipboard and then fiberboard, and then maybe go in full circle around. Fourth thing is plastic-free buildings. We use a lot of plastic in construction, and this is bad not only because it ends up in the sea, but because it's also propping up the fossil fuel industry. I don't think we really know how to deal with this yet. We need new materials. This is perhaps the most provocative bit. We could not build at all, and we could start by not accepting projects like this. This is the Heathrow expansion by Grimshaw, Michael's former employer. I didn't realize that. Okay, we know how to do these things, but they're not currently possible to implement, I don't think. So I'm not here as a director of a practice or as a client or a contractor, but as an employee and a worker. I'm an architect, but under the employment of a company, and that company has clients. So we build housing. Our clients are housing associations, councils, developers. They range from caring and compassionate to less so, and generally, the less caring amongst them will just build to the regulatory minimums. They generally want to do things in the way that most builders know how, the most straightforward way, and they hold the keys or the purse strings, and they all have very, very tight budgets. So my seniors at my practice do care, and they are concerned, but they know how to get things done for our particular mix of clients, and they know what they want as well. So my individual agency in all of this is rather limited. And in fact, most of us as architectural workers have quite limited agency. That's me right there down there, one of those dots. And that's a kind of typical client map of one of our projects. So I could just start a practice, I hear you say, but it's not really that easy. And that won't really solve anything, because it's those clients that build the most that we really need to change. So how to realize our agency? And this is where maybe I drift a bit from building into something else. We can and probably should work at those clients, building a moral case for zero carbon. But I believe our agency is not primarily in the workplace, but as citizens with a professional background and knowledge, which is why I'm involved in Architects Climate Action Network. So I think in order to realize these 5 things, we need first sweeping regulatory change. Go back one. We need to rewrite the economic rules of our industry and shift our cultural values within the industry. And we need new materials. We need bioplastics and things like that, which just don't really exist anymore at the moment. So how do we do that? I think we do it like this. And this is a picture of one of our open meetings for Architects Climate Action Network. We break off into working groups, and each working group is looking at different campaigns about changing bits of regulation or policy. And it's through these meetings that I think we're going to enact the changes that will affect the building industry at large, rather than through individual projects, or as well as through individual projects, I should say. So I would flip the question, not how should we build, but how do we go about regulating building?
Thank you very much, Joe. I'm looking forward to discussing how we can persuade Lord Foster to build a plant-based skyscraper. But I don't know, we can work up some plans. Next, please welcome to the stage Audeline.
Good evening. So this is one of the places that I would be exploring, where I will actually end while visiting different places through this research that I'm currently pursuing. So we're not too far from London. And this is actually quite a respectable attempt of material reused or recycling at a sort of quite informal scale and spontaneous attempt. So this presentation actually will be about the research I am pursuing for the moment, and I will be focusing on two materials which are a little bit the bad boys or the bottom of the class, if you want. And I might not be crediting all the imager or specifying the localization, and this is in respect for the professional that welcomed me on their working site, where some of the copyright constraints are applicable. And this research is actually a cross-industrial research that looks into the building and the movie industry, material flows, but also form of laborers and construction practices. So what you look at for the moment is, well, it could be actually a sort of preserved fragment of ancient Rome. But actually, if you look closer, the sort of backlit thin shell of the construction betray the illusion. Or here, the way the columns, fiberglass hull, are connected. So fiberglass is a material that is omnipresent in the movie industry and quite spread out in the building industry as well. It is, to a certain extent, a new plaster. I mean, in the movie industry, you used to do a lot with plaster, know that you would be doing with fiberglass. And as an example here, you have this workshop adjacent to the Cinecittà studio, which show these original moldings, this library actually of building components, all made out of plaster, but their reproduction would be made out of fiberglass. These are more images of the workshop where sculpture, statue, bust will be reproduced, originally in plaster and today in fiberglass. This is a fourth generation workshop, and they will also produce replicas of Picasso. And so fiberglass is kind of very versatile material. You know, it's waterproof, it's very light, it can be molded in many shapes. And these qualities are surely celebrated in the movie industry and really taken advantage of. It's very resistant, so can last really long, which is, of course, to a certain extent, the absurdity to use it for very temporary reuse. So this is another example of, an entire house might be made out of fiberglass. It can take any shapes and really any finish as well. So this is a rock in fiberglass. And all these qualities and other industries is aware of, which is the fishing or the boat leisure production. And so this is one of the most used material for boat hull. So with Rotor and actually the Architectural Association, we are running for the moment a studio where we exploring places of material production, but also of material resale. And through our exploration, one of our students, Marion, found this boatyard, actually, the boat breaker, which main activity is to cut and dismantle this boat hull. This labor obviously come at a cost. So one alternative that owner would consider is to abandon their boat or to drown it, sunk it. So the boat breaker is basically cutting the hull in different pieces, so they would find a way to landfill. So nowadays, this is the main process in terms of end of life of this material. As I say, alternatively drawn, these boats, and as a proof, these are the beautiful seashell I found this winter on the beach. When you look closer, you see that there are fragments of fiberglass. So Marion's actually project was to see whether she could strategically cut the boat's hull so that they would have a chance to become product or possibly building components. With that in mind, she decided to list this address on Rotor-initiated material reseller database, which is called Opalis. And so that would be a little bit an exception, because this database has, most addresses are material resellers, where this is mostly an address that we hope could inspire a designer to build or design with fragments of fiberglass boat hull. So of course, this material is also widespread in the building industry, and as I said, is not recyclable, or the attend that are currently being developed for the moment predict highly energy demanding processes with also questionable side products. So what is the interest of cross-industrial research? So basically on the left you have the movie industry, on the right the building industry. It's only 1,000 of activity in terms of market, but also material quantity. It's very small, but it has a complete other rhythm, quite obviously. So it builds quickly and it dismantles quickly. So in a certain amount of time, you have many lives where you can possibly test protocols. And also, it's the same team that build and dismantle, which is not the case, obviously, in architecture. Of course, the life cycle of building is also an open question, for how long should we build? It's not like the cycle is increasing in time. We're actually building for less and less longer. So another material of interest is where we believe that it should be either avoided or possibly pushing some reuse practices is, of course, the EPS, expanded polystyrene, which just got delivered here in a studio, like very monolithic elements, like they've just been quarried, a bit of a Zumthor-esque monumentality to a certain extent. But these materials are really worked and crafted to a certain extent. So you have this sort of collage where you have talented artists and sculpture that will really treat this material with a lot of care. Most of these professionals have been trained in school like RCA, and they've been working mostly with noble materials. Once they moved into the job market, this represents more of their daily life. So if you look into the recyclability of this material, so this is the best case scenario where the material is uncoated and the seller will take it back to recycle it through its plant. Another alternative, as I've shown you before, is this sort of more informal small plants where the coating would be extracted with specific tool, and then the material itself would be compressed to 40th of its volume to ultimately, in most cases, be shipped to China, because this is the only place where the remanufacturing or reprocessing facility to create new products from this compressed pellet are located. I will skip this one. So again, like this is obviously a very present material in the building industry, and the demand is indeed increasing. You know, with this sort of contradiction that the more our environmental constraints are increasing, the more we are actually using this plastic-based material. So the industry is doing a lot of effort in research and development to really work on its recyclability, but also to communicate about it. I think we're very much in a position where if we believe things is recyclable, it will be recycled, where it's actually not the case. For example, in the UK, there is no collection point. There is no network for collecting this material. So even if it's technically possible, it doesn't really happen. And as I say, the manufacturers that are actually creating new product with this derivative are located in China. And so far, what I found is like the main product that comes out are architectural moldings or picture frames. And of course, with the open question, you know, how many picture frames do we need on this world? And then, of course, it's a cross-continental process. So this is from a screen from a waste management facility really close to London. And they're very transparent in the fact that this is a cross-continental market. And with the open question, what will happen tomorrow? And when I say tomorrow, I'm pretty literal about it. So that there is like this constant lure about the sort of magic circular arrow. And even if it's not recycled, it's not yet recycled, because ultimately, of course, everything will. This is a very famous diagram, the butterfly diagram by the MacArthur Foundation, and you can see from there that, of course, you know, recycling has a much longer and larger loop than reuse. You know, it requires much more processes and completely change the nature and the form of the material. And so that's a bit of a conclusion, but it's to say that there are a lot of attempts actually to support, I think, also the architects in their endeavor and the draft of the New London Plan, the section about material waste management stipulates that the reuse of material, you know, should be encouraged. But then in the other article, there is always this kind of conflation between reused and recycled, where it's important to note that these are very different processes that are producing different forms of labor and with a very different energy demand. But also to remind ourselves that if we have one agenda, is really into the procurement of materials. And I think that's the kind of power that we can use as architects and not underestimate. And I think that's the precise moment where we can actually make the right decision, informed decision, you know, looking beyond certification and really understand the processes and the social implications involved in any material choice. Thank you.
Thank you, Adelina. I'm now going to consider polystyrene in the same light as nuclear waste. It seems about the same in its bad boy, on the bad boy league table. Finally, this evening, we have Michael Paulin.
I think it's down here. Okay. Yeah, from the beginning. Yeah. Okay, thank you. Right, well, evening. Thanks for involving me. So, as Tom said, I set up my company Exploration in 2007. And when I did that, I really wanted to focus on what I saw as the really urgent issues of the time, which for me then was climate change, biodiversity loss, and resource depletion. And I thought the best way to bring about change was to build exemplar projects, talk positively, and then that would surely just sort of roll out and multiply with the rest of the industry. So I led teams to develop sometimes new building types and sometimes radically rethinking existing building types. So this was an example of a new building type. It's called the Sahara Forest Project. This was one we worked on. This is a zero waste, zero carbon textile factory. This is an ultra low energy data center. And this is the biomimetic office, which is, if it gets built, predicted to be one of the lowest energy office buildings in the world. Now, all of these demonstrated the potential for radical increases in resource efficiency. But relatively few of these have got built. And the most common reason I've received for these projects not getting built is that the market is not ready for this yet. Which is kind of frustrating, particularly with the zero waste textiles factory, where we show we get all the way to zero waste, zero carbon with just a 5-year payback period. And from that point on, it would be way cheaper, way better all round. But apparently, the market is not ready for this. And when the 2018 IPCC report came out and showed that if we carry on as we are, then we're heading towards the apocalypse, I thought, well, this is just completely insane. You know, what is going on? So I reread one of my favorite essays. This is Leverage Points by Donella Meadows. Now, she was one of the greatest systems thinkers of all time. And I really recommend this essay. It's an incredibly important one about how to bring about change. And what she does is she looks at all the different places that you can intervene in a system to bring about change. And she ranks them in order of priority. She comes up with about 12. And what I found really surprising the first time I read it was that some of the things that I thought were influential were actually way down the list. So things like exemplar projects, sector-specific regulations, tax incentives, and so on. So what's at the top of the list? What are the things that she thinks the most influential places to intervene in a system? Well, at the very top, it is changing the paradigm or mindset out of which the system behavior emerges. And the next one down is changing the goals of the system. So back in October 2018, just after the IPCC report and after rereading this, I started 2 new things. So I started working on Architects Declare with Steve Tompkins, and I started working on a new book co-authored with Sarah Ichioka, and it's provisionally titled 8 Paradigms for a Planetary Emergency. I'm going to mention just 4 this evening. And each one of these by itself would be enough to bring about collapse. So these are current paradigms that are very dominant. So the first one is endless growth. The second one is linear resource use. The third one is a sort of metaphor that really drives the world economy, which is the idea of this conquest of nature. And then the fourth one, which may surprise you, is sustainable design. Sustainability, I think, has been a disaster. You know, half of humanity's historical carbon emissions have occurred since the start of the sustainability age. I mean, I'm taking that as when the Brundtland report, Our Common Future, was issued. You know, that was when most people recognized when sustainability became mainstream. So that last one, that may surprise some people. Let me explain why I feel that. So this is a diagram from Bill Reed. And this shows different levels of environmental design performance, starting with conventional practice, which you could characterize as one step better than breaking the law. Just above that is a lot of green design, so that's a lot of LEED and BREEAM and so on, which is relative improvement. And then above that is 100% sustainable, which Bill McDonough has characterized as 100% less bad. And the problem with this is that anything less than 100% less bad is just part of a degenerative downward cycle. And that's where nearly all of what we've been working on for the last 30 years has been. And that was quite a painful realization for me, having worked on sustainable projects for 30 years, that all we've been doing is making things slightly less bad. And what we really need to do is to get above that line of neutrality and explore the fertile area of regenerative design, which in simple terms is about striving for a maximum positive impact. And just as people debated, what is the ultimate in sustainable design 20, 30 years ago, I think there's a really rich debate to be had about what is the ultimate in regenerative design. And my belief is that it's striving for a state of co-evolution with nature. I'll say a little bit about what I mean by regenerative design, not much given the short amount of time, but starting with regenerative landscapes, this is what was achieved in the lowest plateau in China by a soil scientist called John D. Liu, and that was just 10 years between those two. So it's perfectly possible to restore landscapes on a massive scale. We explored this on a small scale with the first version of the Sahara Forest Project, which we built in Qatar. So that was it on site. This is a project that brings together cycles of food, energy, water, and waste. And this was it on opening day. And alongside twiddling all the sort of knobs for the technical aspects of the project, we looked at what this was doing to the landscape. And we had a hunch this was delivering regenerative benefits. And there was literally nothing there to start with, but we made a note of any mammals, birds, and insects that appeared on site. So the first things to appear were flies, not particularly interesting. Next thing were birds. They appeared the first day we brought the first plants to site. About a week later, we had the first insects, grasshoppers, quickly followed by crickets. And a month later, we had the first butterfly. And bear in mind, this was about 5 kilometers from the nearest patch of planting. And then as the birds got more established, as the plants got more established, we had more birds, more insects. Then we had the first problematic species, those were rats, and their numbers started expanding rather rapidly. But still, more birds, more insects, which is all very nice. Then we had mice to deal with. And then 3 days after the algae ponds were filled, we had the first dragonflies. I'm going through this rather quickly, excuse me. Then more insects, more birds. Oh yeah, we had a feral cat, so it was quite handy. The number of rats started going down. Quite a rare bird, the hoopoe. And eventually, we had the first indigenous mammal. This is it's called a jerboa. It's like a little hopping kangaroo. Now, all of that was achieved in just 8 months on a site 100 meters by 100 meters. And what that shows is that if you create the right conditions, then nature has an amazing capacity to regenerate. So regenerative cities, I think the best way of describing this is the idea put forward by Biomimicry 3.8. They're a group of consultants in the US. And what they argue is that when you're designing a new city or a new piece of city, you should start by analyzing how a pristine ecosystem in that part of the world functions. How much oxygen does it produce? How much water does it filter? How much carbon does it sequester? How much food does it produce? How much biodiversity does it accommodate? And those should become the targets for your new piece of city. We're nowhere near that at the moment, but I'm absolutely convinced that when we get there, then we can say with some certainty that we have integrated that bit of city into a broader, stable system. And there are regenerative approaches to buildings and materials. Using more and more plant-based materials is an important one. And all of this is leading us closer to biology in design terms. Now, biomimicry has been, I think, rather sort of underexplored by the architectural press, and when it is described, it tends to be in rather superficial terms. But if you want to see a much more profound sort of treatise on biomimicry, then I recommend an essay called Towards a Deeper Philosophy of Biomimicry by a philosopher called Freya Matthews. And just to finish with, I want to talk about this organism. So this is a glass sponge. This has evolved to make glass fiber with higher optical quality than human-made glass fiber, with about 1/1,000,000th of the energy. So this shows a lot of the things that we need to strive for, and we could achieve with a greater effort in biomimicry. Ultra-low energy manufacturing, cyclical resource use. This even demonstrates 2 forms of symbiotic relationship. And to conclude, I want to give the last word to Donella Meadows. You may be wondering, well, okay, these grand paradigm shifts, how do we achieve them? And what Donella Meadows said is that, first of all, you keep pointing at the anomalies and failures in the old paradigm. You keep speaking and acting loudly and with assurance from the new one. You insert people with the new paradigm in places of public visibility and power. And you don't waste time with the reactionaries. Rather, you work with active change agents and with the vast middle ground of people who are open-minded. And this doesn't mean that we shouldn't bother with things like important initiatives like the circular economy and so on, but the point is that while the global economy is fixed on this metaphor of conquest of nature, then I think no amount of well-meaning projects exploring the circular economy is really going to change that. We need to still talk about the circular economy and zero carbon. Those are all important, but increasingly we need to frame those within these really crucial paradigm shifts that we need to bring about. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And if I could invite the three speakers up onto stage, we'll continue the discussion. That was a nice positive end, I think, to what can be quite a paralyzing and depressing situation, Michael. To begin with, I want to talk a bit about that paralysis. In the audience today, we've got a large number of students, some of whom I teach. Hello, everybody. I'd like you to address them and give them one thing that they could do in their practice, their profession, moving forward, starting tomorrow, that will make a difference. Who wants to go first? Stunned silence.
I can
Come
go
on,
first.
Michael.
Well, within Architects Declare, we've been having some very interesting discussions recently about our theory of change. What do we want to achieve and how are we going to achieve it? And we've been talking about, where does agency lie? And Steve said something very interesting the other day. We're trying to establish the limits to individual agency and where we need other people to demonstrate agency. And we concluded that it actually makes sense to see it in layers, starting with individuals, then companies, then networks, institutions, governments, and global, and so on. And in a way, each of those layers has to kind of de-risk the situation for the one above, because we know that there's an absolute dearth of political leadership, and we're not going to see that change overnight. And the only way it's going to change is for all of us to maximize our individual agency and pressurize those in the level above to do the same.
So keep kind of advocating for that change.
Absolutely.
Audeline, what would you advise?
Yeah, I would advise two things. First of all, confederate, like find the right allies, with whom you can move in action quite quickly. And I think let's move, try to make some groundbreaking project, very small, but there is something
that's a big ask. Groundbreaking.
No, but very small.
Oh, small groundbreaking. Okay.
Yes, there is nothing as powerful as a very successful case study. I think to contaminate a culture such as architecture. So I mean, as we've seen the project by Pamela Gormley, I think that's case study are very powerful. And then the second thing I would suggest is really to explore the opalis.co.uk database, because for small-scale projects, you can really start procuring material from these resellers. That is a form of economy that is really well distributed on the UK territory, and you can actually also support these businesses and kind of support them to operate to a transition where material reuse will be as easy to procure as first-hand material.
Well, we'll come on to reuse a bit later on. Joe, what would you advise?
I would also advise two things, probably very similar words. Firstly, collaborate. We're all taught in architecture school that we are the ones with all the answers, which is just not really true. There are loads of groups around London now where people from different practices are meeting up and kind of discussing what they don't know and sharing what they do know. And so I think we're not really going to get through this unless we collaborate on that kind of scale across the industry. The other thing would be to interrogate. So everything that you're told at work, just interrogate the truth of that, I suppose. There's a lot of inertia in the industry, that kind of ways of doing things which are just the status quo, and unless you interrogate why that is, we'll never get past that. And use of all materials can be interrogated really simply by asking suppliers for EPDs, so you can see where that product's come from and things like that. And yeah, so I'd say collaborate and interrogate.
I like that idea of collaboration. I think over the last 30 or 40 years within architectural culture and within culture and society at large, of course, competition has been the dominant narrative. I think we're seeing that kind of change beginning to happen, certainly within a younger generation. Certainly people are beginning to ask questions again, perhaps like they did in the 1970s, about cooperation, collaboration, how different kind of networks can form. But let's start. Let's start really with materials. Should certain materials be banned? Come on, Audley. Or should architects not use them? Let's start with concrete. The C word. Are they your bad boys?
Well, as you know, plastic is fantastic. Huh? I mean, just a plastic bag. It's light. It's waterproof. I think if there's one thing I would take on an island, that would be a plastic bag. So I think banning is probably not the right word, is understand the scale of implication of our decision, I would say, and to which extent we are using them. And also once, they are in traffic, as one can say, to actually try to reuse the one that have been already produced rather than continue to produce similar materials.
There was, Michael, last autumn at the Barbican, there was an event where there was a kind of a conclusion that architects should be, if not compelled, should certainly elect to not use concrete. What do you think of that?
We should certainly use a lot less concrete, and we should start exploring new ways of making concrete. There are some companies doing that, because the closest thing to concrete in biology is coral reef. That's a large mineral structure. That takes carbon out of the atmosphere, whereas making concrete emits huge amounts of carbon. So, it is high time we started researching alternatives, but we can't necessarily wait for that. So I think there is a very good case for using ultra-low energy materials, a lot of plant-based materials. I'm not a big fan of banning materials myself. I think there are certain really egregious cases where a ban is appropriate. I think it's better to try and create the conditions out of which the right kind of behavior emerges. So for instance, if we were to, at a political level, internalize all the damage costs of materials, then very quickly there would be a cost incentive to use the right kind of materials that are much less damaging to the environment.
How do you think that change might take place in order to create a market for such things? How is that? What do we see?
Realistically, only through a massive shift of the Overton window.
What's the Overton window?
Sorry. That's a term for the sort of the frame of what is thought to be politically realistic and even worth debating. If it's outside the Overton window, then it's just too radical. Okay? The Overton window has shifted a lot in the last 6 months, I think, but it needs to shift a hell of a lot more. And about a year ago, I went to see a very senior person within the construction industry to talk about Architects Declare and so on. And I can't say who it is, but he has advised a lot of government figures. He has sat in rooms with the likes of George Osborne and David Cameron, and he's a sort of small C conservative. And I was surprised at how direct he was. He said, the planet is screwed. He used a more direct word than that. The only hope now is massive scale non-violent civil disobedience. And I agree. So, alongside advocating all these things, maximizing our agency as architects, we need to get out on the street.
Out of the lecture halls, out on the street, maybe afterwards. We'll
because
not head to the bar, we'll
it's
head
only
outside.
by doing that we can really change the system.
Okay, so massive direct action. Everything that Extinction Rebellion has been doing.
Don't get yourself arrested unless you really know what you're doing. So, but there are plenty of ways of protesting without getting arrested.
Okay, you can give us some tips later on. Joe, how about you? Would you ban certain materials?
I don't think the materials themselves should be banned, but I do think that we should create the conditions where certain materials can't be used because they just don't align to some regulation or the other.
So they become unacceptable. A bit like smoking or something.
Yeah, exactly like that. The use of concrete is, we're not going to be able to do without concrete, I don't think. But we could do without it on the kind of upper floors of buildings. And, you look just outside down the road and the Google headquarters, which is being built, which has just got this obscene amount of concrete and steel in it. we could change regulations so that buildings like that just won't be allowed to be built. So it's not really a ban of the material itself, but it's, just kind of changing the rules, I suppose.
And how about advocating for, I mean, it was a telling phrase, plant-based buildings, plant-based materials. How can that advocacy, how can an architect be that advocate?
I don't know, that's a very good question, and I wish Paloma was here because the story of the hemp house just sounds really fascinating, because it was built from materials that were grown in the fields surrounding the house, and that hemp grew very quickly and sequestered a lot of carbon while it did so. And obviously they must have had long conversations with the client and the landowner about how exactly that would happen. And I wonder how that can be scaled up to housing developments of 2,000, where we'll get that material. I don't know if we can grow that much in the UK to really build the amount of houses that we need to. But I really think that, we don't know enough about timber as architects and hemp, but there could be people in the design team, if we're talking about collaboration, there could be people that do. And so we should bring them in, I think.
I mean, for the case of timber is interesting. It is something that obviously can sequester carbon. The question with timber I always have is thinking about building materials and buildings through their entire life. I'm always puzzled about what happens at the end of that life. What happens to the timber? Presumably it gets, what happens to it?
Well, that's actually a big debate in the kind of sustainability consulting world, because some embodied carbon kind of surveyors count sequestration. Some don't, and that's because of the end of life cycle. So when timber is taken out of a building, you can't guarantee that it's going to be reused. If it's not, it goes to landfill, it rots. That carbon is actually then emitted again.
Or it can be burnt. I mean, I've read that it can be burnt as well, which is clearly not good.
Yeah, and so some people count it and some people don't, and it makes a massive difference when you're surveying the amount of embodied carbon in a building, if you count sequestration or not. So the kind of jury's out on that.
Okay, so if we're not going to ban certain materials, but we're going to encourage the use through advocacy of more positive materials, how about building types? Joe, you suggested or presented the idea that architects perhaps should elect not to work on certain building types, which perhaps encourage more carbon-guzzling behaviour, for example, the obvious one being airports. Michael, where do you stand on that? As a former employee of Grimshaw's.
Well, I wrote a piece for the AJ recently about that, arguing that what we need to do is look at the numbers. It's not enough to just have sort of stories about the future. So often you find people hold on quite tenaciously to their stories about the future. I'm enormously optimistic about the potential for algal biofuels, that kind of thing. I mean, that by itself is a story. And I co-wrote this with Steve Tompkins. What we tried to do is go through all the numbers of air travel, looking at the possible solutions, and the conclusion, if you look through the numbers, is that we don't have a technological fix on the horizon near enough. Batteries, the best batteries at the moment have only 3% of the energy density of kerosene. So you'd have to have 38 tons of batteries to replace 1 ton of kerosene. You don't need to be Einstein to realize that doesn't work at the moment, and it's going to be a long, long time before it does. So my personal feeling is that we have to start reducing our flying through policies like the frequent flyer levy. And it's worth bearing in mind that business travel has actually dropped, business air travel. There are 1 million fewer flights now for business purposes than there were 13 years ago. The main growth areas are in people flying to second homes and tax havens. I don't think it would upset too many people if they had to constrain their behavior a bit. And people flying on cheap holidays. Now, that is a slightly more difficult one because it would be a bit unfair to penalise people on very low incomes. But that's where the frequent flyer levy is actually quite well designed as a policy instrument, because your first flight would have a low level of taxation, your next flight would have a much higher, and so on.
And should architects elect not, I mean, that's within their agency, not to work on certain projects that encourage certain behaviours?
My personal approach through my business is that we do refuse projects that are kind of egregiously unsustainable.
Right. Would you? Would you refuse? Somebody came knocking on the door for an airport.
Well, I was actually taking the question in another way. You know, I think as a field, as a profession, we have to ask ourselves also whether we need to accept commission at the other end of the world, and contribute, maybe if the ratio is getting lower, still contribute to the business flying team. So yes, I think that's an open question that is worth asking as well. I think there's usually quite a lot to do where we are, and so I think we could also try to stay focused on our geography.
Or immediate environment, rather
Yes.
than having to jet off and work in a completely different context and a different culture.
Mm-hmm.
Joe?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that sentiment. I included that image of Icarus because I think the story of him and his construction melting is quite apt, and I think it applies to this. Like, if you have to accept an airport project to sustain your business, then your business is simply doing the wrong thing for the planet. And I would agree that we need to then rethink the goals of our business and maybe just take local projects instead. I do think that architects could make a very big point if they pulled out of projects that are to do with the fossil fuel, infrastructure that we all rely on. But yeah, if Grimshaw pulled out of Heathrow, the story would be so massive that it would mean that I think we'd reconsider as a society whether Heathrow needed to be expanded. And so he does, I think, have some agency there. He's probably not even able to pull out because he's got shareholders to please or something. I don't know, but yeah.
Have you got his number on speed dial?
I'll give him a call now.
So if that's the case, in terms of architects' agency, okay, they can advocate for certain buildings, certain materials. They can push back as far as they can. They're not compelled to do so. I mean, there's only been, as I understand it, the change in the, getting technical here, RIBA Code of Practice was that last year or the year before, which slightly altered the compulsion on the part of the architect to push back against the client. I mean, how do we change that let's get down to brass tacks, capitalist system, essentially, of procuring buildings in this country? It seems so immense. How is it just through advocacy, through case study, through role models?
Yeah, I mean, I think I might quote you. You mentioned the fiscal system, and I think that's quite a useful mechanism, to tune the reality. So the question is, how do you reach, decision making at the level of the fiscal system? But I think if architects, could weave their way towards having a discussion, probably equipped with economics specialists with them to understand a bit more of the different mechanisms that could be applied.
I mean, this is certainly something that we'll be talking about in the final fundamentals discussion, how you affect that systems change, that change of mindset that you talked about, Michael. How is that possible to change how we think, to get out of that idea of, say, economic growth, which of course has been fundamental to certainly the building industry, certainly over the last 200 or 300 years. I wrote down, you talked about changing the goals of the system. The goals of the system, of course, of the built environment are profit making. So how do we engage with that? That's not going to change anytime soon. It's still going to be profit making at the heart of the system by 2030. How do we engage with that? How do we convince the big developers, the big building contractors, that there is profit, there's something in for them? Or is that completely impossible? Joe?
Well, I think at some point it will simply flip, and there'll be more money to be made in building kind of green buildings and
what, generationally? There'll be a generational...
We saw it in the last year with wind energy. Suddenly it became cheaper than coal energy. which I think was a big moment and a positive news story from last year, because now it's the thing to invest in.
Because attitudes have changed. I mean, we've seen that over the last 15 months, been a rapid change of attitudes, popular attitudes.
Yeah, and I suppose technology's caught up or something. But yeah, the thing about the ROBA and the kind of role of the architect, I think, is quite important. We probably should rewrite our codes, and especially the ARB's architect's code, which is intended to protect the public against architects. But if part of what architects are doing is kind of destroying the world, and we are part of that system, then could you not kind of change the code a little bit to protect the planet or the environment as well? I don't know. You have to stick to the code. So
one of the key things, I'm surprised you haven't mentioned it already, is that kind of very arcane-sounding, is it Part L of the building regulations?
Yeah, yeah.
And I think this is something that all of you probably could get involved with. There's a deadline, I think, isn't it? 7th of February?
7th of February, it's next Friday. Yeah, we've been doing a fair bit of work, actually.
Tell the audience a little bit about it.
Yeah, so the government is changing building regulations. They're bringing in what they are calling the Future Homes Standard in 2025, and part of that is changes to Part L and Part F. That's to do with energy use of buildings and airtightness of buildings. They're consulting on the options for change at the moment. And this group called LETI, London Energy Transformation Initiative, have done some really good work. They're mostly engineers. They've been testing the new and proposed regulations, and which has revealed that basically the standards are kind of getting worse. Our buildings will be able to be less energy efficient than they are at the moment. And that's because the new regulations rely too heavily on technology, bolt-on technology like heat pumps, which are good, but it will still mean that our houses are using more energy per square metre than they currently are. Whether that energy is green, it's neither here nor there. There's a few other things in the changes. They're proposing to strip the right of local authorities to set higher energy efficiency standards within their areas. So all the local authorities that have declared climate emergency and set better standards will be pegged back by that. There's no talk about embodied carbon in the Future Home Standard at all, and I don't think that's very progressive at all. I don't think that's the change that we need to see. So the consultation is running until next Friday. There's like 69 questions or so on the government website that are mostly multiple choice, and you can put explanations in. LETI and ourselves, ACAN, have both put guidance on our websites about how to respond to that consultation. We've also got letters that we're going to send to the minister and things like that you can sign. But I would urge you to kind of look into it in the next day, because if you want to do the consultation response properly and give it the right kind of time, it will take a bit of time to type out all the explanations. There's a 10-minute version that you can do, which is just taking the yes/no answers. So yeah, I would urge you to look at our website and Letty's website.
So that's something constructive that somebody could do straight away.
Yeah.
That will have a major impact, potentially.
I think it will have a really big impact, because 150,000 houses are built every year, there or thereabouts. We might be about to be building a lot more, and every house has to meet Part L. And so if Part L is potentially getting worse, then we could end up with 150,000 more houses every year that are slightly less insulated than ones we're building now. Yeah, I mean, it just seems really important.
Before I open it up to the audience, sorry.
Can I just respond to what you were saying? Because you were asking about whether it is advocacy, is that what's going to help bring about this? And I think the answer is partly. So, as Danella Meadows said, it's partly about continually pointing out the flaws in the current system. And I occasionally meet some people from a sort of death cult that believe in endless growth. You may have heard of them, they're called Goldman Sachs. If you say to them, do you really think it's possible to keep going with 3% growth? Because that means that we would double the size of the global economy in just 23 years and double it again in 46 years. Do you really think, bumping up against all these limits to resource limits, climate change and so on, do you really think that's possible? And they tend to look a bit sheepish. And of course, they can't defend that. So that's one thing. I think advocacy alone is not enough by itself, because what we need to do is push towards a tipping point. And I think there are signs that we're getting close to a tipping point. You know, when the Financial Times runs a whole series of articles, it was titled something like Capitalism, Time for a Reset, I think. And also, if you look at some of the abuse that Greta Thunberg was getting, which is obviously obnoxious, but if you look at major shifts in history, where tipping points, just before the tipping point, you found that the last bastion of resistance was always angry old white men. And those are exactly the people who were having a go at Greta Thunberg. So, you know, in that respect, you could look at that sort of positively. I'm not advocating abuse, but I think you know what I mean. And the Part L, absolutely, yes, we should respond to that and say it's outrageous and so on. But I'm conscious I'm sounding like some kind of communist radical, which I'm not. But just think for a moment about the root cause of that. You know, how did this proposal to weaken Part L come about? I don't know for sure, but if you want to go on the Conservative Party website and you click on the funding tab, you can find an option called the Leaders Group. If you pay £50,000 a year, you can sit down regularly for dinner with the Prime Minister and senior ministers, and it doesn't say this, but obviously talk about policy. You wouldn't pay £50,000 a year to enjoy Theresa May's scintillating conversation. You would do it because you're going to get at least £50,000 worth of policy benefit out of it. And it's quite possible that some of the big house builders, some of them are funders of the Conservative Party, had a 5-minute conversation with a minister saying, well, we're going to struggle to meet housing targets unless you weaken Part L. And the bitter injustice to this is that it took that person perhaps 5 minutes to weaken it, and then it takes thousands of hours of talented people's time to try and resist that. And that's why we have to bring about system change. It's totally unacceptable, in my view, that in this day and age, you can pay £50,000 to influence policy. In a democracy, everyone should have an equal vote.
This old Marxist says, woo! Thank you. Right, we've got time for questions. I don't know if are there roving mics? Yes, there's a roving mic over there. Hello, roving mic. Who's got a question for the panel or a comment? Keep it short if you can and snappy. There's one just at the back there. I can see a hand.
Hi, my name's Jonathan Jewell. I was a student here in Art Theory and Philosophy course just a couple of years back. I was very interested in watching something very recently, which I think might relate to the advocacy thing. And that was, I think it was just yesterday, there was a debate taking place, and I think it was on CNN, saying that Trump, who obviously I think people possibly heard of, and the way he's been going and approaching these problems, he tends to lie about things. But he lies in a very random way, advocating for every position, like everything on every side of every discussion and debate. And one of the things I thought was really interesting is, say, if you take particular quotations and you say Trump has said this, which he has said and which you can show them, people will take a pathway which is as radically against everything that they believed in as they've done before. And actually, these are the paradigms of sort of like the left and the right and the ways in which people behave. Those who follow Trump are willing to abandon everything and go off, and you can see it when they're doing the debates over in Senate. They'll say, well, that's not so bad, that's not such a big thing. So I think up until now, my background was in cognitive and decision science before I came in here, so I've been quite involved in systems. I did ergonomics and so on. But there has been some questions recently about how fragile are these paradigms? How much of those paradigms are actually not really particular viewpoints or points of view that people relate to? And rather than that, is it the question that they are in fact reacting to sort of goals which have got a concreteness that they can sort of like see? And sometimes those goals are attached to individuals instead of actually instead of some kind of sort of like worldview which might become subordinated to it. The only other thing I would say, just in relation to the Overton window, is I'm the National Communications Officer for the Industrial Workers of the World at the moment, and we, at our last Delegates Executive Committee, agreed on setting a 3-day week as being our agitational demand, something I'm going to be discussing with the person in charge of the Applied Imagination course. And traditional idea of the Overton window is these are the limits by which you're going to get change. And the TUC and most of the unions have approached things from a side which says, 4-day week, let's see if we can sell it and add to this idea, this notion that you'll get a longer weekend and people be more relaxed and as a result more productive. The purpose of us doing this, even though it's ludicrous to suggest an agitational demand, like I think possibly for architecture that would be we no longer work with concrete anymore. Not possible, probably, I'm not an architect, but the fact that you make that statement actually agitates people and gets people to think, wow, this is a real paradigming shift of the way we're going to be working in this industry. We're drawing a line in the sand here. So those are the 2 points. One was about paradigms and their stability, and particularly their perceived stability in the mind of the individual. And secondly, the one that relates to where we place demands, rather than taking sort of like verbatim the fact that the Overton window is a very established thing within policy and theory and innovation.
So if I'm understanding you right, it's support for more advocacy, more role models, more case studies, and more provocation?
More lying and just not adopting every single position and then taking a particular... Well, not necessarily that, but recognising... Sorry, thank you. Recognising that, I mean, one of the things I'm about to write on in my blog is a thing called pre-truth. Rather than saying that we've moved into post-truth, we've gone from pre-truth and now we're arriving at a truth where there's a plurality of views. Different things are heard in different ways and they're heard through narratives. And actually these things coexist at the same time. And it's the way in which they're perceived. So I think it is about, some of it is to try and regain control over things like mimetic transmission, the idea that we can send this thing around and people will grab control of it. So I think there's a degree to which it's, yes, attaching it to people, but it's attaching it to the messages that people have. So it's a bit closer to that link between, I guess in communication theory, the person who transmits and the medium and the way in which they do that transmission and how that can sort of like actually have a positive impact.
All right. Thank you for your comment. Thank you. Any other questions or comments out there? Yes, here in the second to front row.
Thank you. Absolutely fantastic discussion. First of all, power is knowledge, and you guys seem to have the knowledge and certain amount of power. Why don't we, through you guys, raise £50,000, insert them into the actual places of power, and then we can have a say.
Michael.
Well, it's a tempting thought.
Crowdfunding.
I don't know if I could manage to be polite to Boris Johnson, but if it was all for the greater good, I'm sure I could.
But the power, I mean, the interesting point, I mean, even in connection with the previous comment is about how the powers of persuasion. You know, what tactics we employ in our practice, whatever we're doing, whether we're historians or journalists like me, or whether we're architects or people that are procuring buildings, what can we all do? How can we persuade people? What tactics are out there to persuade people to try and win the argument to kind of keep positive? Uli.
Well, maybe I'll answer you and I'll answer the first question. Also, I mean, there's this theory, you fake it until you make it. And I think, you know, this idea of creating your own utopia, even if it's not completely real, but the idea still of leading the way at small scale, creating exemplary projects, I think that's still, for me, the most powerful tool, which requires a lot of work and a lot of focus. Yes.
Okay. And Joe, would you go undercover in Boris Johnson's government with £50,000 in your wallet?
I also don't think I could be in that room. I'm not sure I trust myself to not be corrupted either in that situation.
Oh, hello. And yet, these are the people, these are the very people we have to persuade. These are the very people. And trying to think about what tactics, not that I've got the answer here tonight, but what tactics we use to try and win the argument with the hedge funders, the Goldman Sachs, the Boris Johnsons, the Donald Trumps. How do we win that argument, or we just have to wait for generational change to do its trick?
Well, I think stories are really important, actually. And Greta Thunberg's speeches are, I think, incredibly powerful. And that's because she talks about a kind of personal story. and how she came around to kind of understand the climate crisis. And the fact that she's a child as well is very powerful. And I think the more people like that we have kind of advocating change, the harder it will be for the old white men in power to not do anything about it. And so I think her presence is good. But you can see her just getting really annoyed at having to go and speak at Davos and then no one really paying any attention. So I think eventually they will have to change, and it will be because of these emotive, personal stories.
I mean, a highly skilled communicator. She is. I mean, even in her use of social media is absolutely incredible. The fact that she responds overnight to Donald Trump, or almost instantly to Donald Trump. I mean, kind of amazing, really. Other questions? Oh, we've got. Well, let's start over here with Professor Till, and then we'll go here.
A lot of you already talked about this or hinted about this, but it's the role of the construction industry, and Michael's quite right. I'm sure that Persimmon's contributions to the Conservative Party had something to do with Part L. But my question is really, what can we do about the construction industry? What in as much as, you know, what's happening in Grenfell today, for example, is already impacting, and Grenfell is a disaster of the construction industry, is already impacting on the way that materials, so that CLT timber is not going to be built in the next 5 years because of Grenfell. And because the construction industry and the insurers will say you can't do it, and regulatory things. So your plant-based stuff, which I completely believe in, will go out of the window. So my question is, how do we address the issue of the construction industry, who are going to be the blockers in both their practices, their persuasion with the government, and so on? How do we circumvent in any way the power of the construction industry in blocking what should be done in relation to the climate emergency?
Who wants to take that one? Come on, Audlene. Do we have to create a completely different system? Is actually trying to persuade the construction industry with all of its cement lobbyists and so on, is it not even worth it? Do we create our own systems, our own markets?
Yes, I'm afraid I have no answer for that, but maybe something I would like to add to the discussion is maybe a nuance between what the message is and the process, because so we're all aware that there are some leading forces that are also taking the sustainability agenda on their shoulders, and so it's not so much what the message is, but who's behind and what are the processes involved to actually target a specific aim. So it's like this distinction of between the aim and the processes.
Michael, how would you persuade the construction industry magnates to change their ways?
Well, I mean, it is a tough one, and it's partly a tough one because of the sort of power structures that exist. So unfortunately, there isn't a particularly easy answer. But I think it is still worth advocating rational solutions to tragedies like Grenfell. Lloyd Alter, who writes for Tree Hugger a while ago, he wrote a very persuasive piece about how it's actually time we had sprinklers in nearly all buildings. And his rationale for that was, if we did that, we then would not have to have any fire retardants in materials and in fabrics and building materials and so on. And we'd be able to build quite a lot higher with timber. We'd be able to design out a lot of the toxins in the built environment. And I think he's actually got a very good point. And for me, that would be a much better response to Grenfell, in addition to having at least 2 escape stairs. I mean, it's insane that we were able to build high-rise towers with only a single means of escape. But in terms of heading off the unfortunate direction that the debate is heading in terms of timber construction, I think that would be a much better approach. But I mean, unfortunately, I don't have a particularly satisfactory answer to your question, Jeremy, because it is a really tough one. I don't think we will substantially change the power of the construction industry until we do start to dismantle some of those power structures.
There was a question. Sorry.
just to say, I think there is some hope. If you look at what Mikhail Richards and Cathy Hawley did in Norwich in relation to the Passive House scheme, they did it through intervening in the procurement processes, as I understand, and therefore taking control through their architectural intelligence of the process of how you procure buildings. And so by doing that, you can actually begin to reassert some of your agency.
Yes, and I suppose that's that moment where, as a practice or as a practitioner within architecture, you can look at the system of how you create a building and say, right, I'm going to intervene here. You do have power, you do have advocacy to push back far more than, say, the RIBA Code of Practice currently compels you. It's about deciding where you intervene, where you can push back, I think.
Just comment on that as well. I'm really glad you brought this example up about Grenfell and the fire regs, because this is part B of the building regulations, and this, you see, is the power of regulatory change. And that happened for good reason. It was good that they looked at the building regulations after Grenfell, and it was because of a tragedy and an emergency. And we have a different kind of tragedy and emergency in the climate crisis, and that should be that should spur on huge regulatory changes as well. So we need new parts to the building regulations that have the same impact that these changes to Part B are having on CLT and timber use. And I think we'll manage to make the argument against wood being included in those kind of banned materials, but and people are working quite hard on that. But it's going to take a lot of time.
I suppose one of the difficulties is that where the places of power are not necessarily the places which are currently experiencing the harshest effects of the climate emergency, i.e. the global south, being places where we are seeing the major effect of the climate emergency, rather than places like London. We can see the effects if you're keen-eyed in London.
Yeah.
But where the centres of power are at the moment, that immediate sight of what the effect of global climate change is happening is not getting into the boardrooms of the construction industry.
Yeah.
Yet.
And you can still find allies, in some position of power. I think one sort of instrumental moment is to find allies of weight. And it's one after another. If I look a little bit at Rotor's evolution, they've been starting, I think, probably 5 years ago to do this pre-demolition inventory, where they will survey every building component of a building before demolition. They've started doing that as a sort of freelance practice for small projects, and since 2 years they have like much bigger clients. One can say unlighted real estate developers, and these people do have a certain power, and it's not to say that they don't have a mind to make thoughtful decisions. So I think these are really the hinge, is to find the right people in power, and they do exist. Yes, more nuance maybe to bring into this idea of power.
Thank you. There was the lady here that's been very patiently waiting. There on the second row, would you mind putting your hand up? Just there we go. Third row, sorry.
I was just wondering how convinced you are by the change that's sort of been happening, maybe even within your own career, like what have you seen that's happened that maybe you feel like is hope for us, basically.
Where's the hope, folks?
There is the hope.
I went to an event on Monday night, actually, at the Building Centre, and it was put on by LETI, London Energy Transformation Initiative. Over the last year, 100 of them have been writing this climate emergency design guide. It was probably one of the only hopeful moments I've had of the last couple of years to do with this issue. But there were 500 people in the room, and the guide is just incredibly well put together, and it, for the first time, actually felt like people were serious about tackling the climate emergency in the construction industry. And the guide is going to be disseminated and used by a lot of designers, I think, and I hope. And Yeah, so that's the source of hope. Read it.
It's very accessible as well. It's written and designed in a very accessible way, because often that's one of the problems. How do you get these often incredibly complex arguments? I mean, even the diagram that you put up of the circular economy with the butterfly wings, I look at that and I go, God, there's so much going on there. How can I absorb it all? But it's a really good, interesting guide. Where's the hope?
Well, there's an expression which I do think is a good one, which is that it's not hope that leads to action, it's action leads to hope. So we all have to try and maximize our agency. And I feel we do have a chance of bringing about a tipping point sometime between now and November. There's going to be a lot of attention focused on the UK and COP26 in Glasgow. So, a lot of the Declare's initiatives are very active now. We're collaborating with others. So we're thinking about holding some kind of big event in central London, maybe at Westminster City Hall, I don't know yet. But the idea is that we would get all the Declares groups. So architects declare, culture declares, music declares, heritage declares, lawyers declares. We've even got vets declares. I don't know why that sounds comical somehow, but anyway,
architectural historians declare.
The more, the merrier. And if we could get enough of those people together and make a joint statement to say to government, we have all the solutions we need to make rapid action, to make rapid progress on climate change and biodiversity. Will you now act? It's things like that that could help push us to the tipping point. And often, if you look at historical examples of tipping points, things have changed very, very, very slowly, and then it all happens in a rush. The Earth lawyer, Polly Higgins, who tragically died last year, she was the lawyer who advocated this idea of the law of ecocide. There's a great podcast on The Future is Beautiful with her, where she talks about being in Vienna 3 weeks before the Berlin Wall came down, and saying to one of her friend's dads, do you think the Berlin Wall will ever come down? And he said, no, not in my lifetime. Not going to happen. 3 weeks later, it came down. And she went back to see them about 3 weeks after that again. And he said, oh, it was always going to happen. It was inevitable. Anyone could see it was going to come down. And so often it seems like change is never going to happen, and then it happens very quickly. But we've all got to get involved in making it happen.
Audley?
Yes, from the movie industry perspective, actually, that I get to know a bit better, I really saw a shift in the course of the last 2 years. And now I can really witness this bottom-up approach where you have entire team testing new products, or like bio paint, or as a side project. So there you have all this sort of self-initiated, self-motivated, and also confederation amongst the guild of the industry. The communication has already also completely shifted. So yes, I can see a lot of changes.
I mean, with my old man's hat on, I can certainly think and look back to my childhood. Climate change was a thing that radicalized me, or got me into politics as a teenager after the Brundtland Report in 1987. Little do you all know that I was the Greta Thunberg of Worcester, a small cathedral city. Wrong gender, of course, and slightly less, more modest impact. But it was the thing that really radicalized me. And I've kept in touch with green politics, but I got radicalized by socialism and left politics soon afterwards. But looking back, you can see that even going back to the 1960s, seeing how the ecological agenda, environmentalism, whatever you want to call it, rises and falls, disappears, comes back, disappears. I would say, looking back now, the shift in public perception that I've noticed is unlike anything that I've seen before. That gives me a great deal of hope that there is a radical change and it's being communicated across the country. And secondly, trying to turn the frown upside down, that thing I mentioned at the beginning, multiple crises. All of these crises, whether it's the aging population in the West, whether it's the upcoming demographic boom in Africa, whether it's housing crises, whether it's nuclear proliferation, they all are coming together now in a slightly, oh my God, kind of way. All of these crises are going to affect change. I mean, it's inevitable. A change is going to come. And we probably should end it there, because it's getting on for 8:15, and we better wrap up. This is just a beginning, of course. These are all beginnings. It's beginnings for this series of fundamentals. I hope you'll all join us in a couple of weeks and thereafter a fortnight after that. In 2 weeks, we'll be talking about the city, about the landscape. Our focus will be widening from the building. After that, we'll be talking about attitudes, practice, habits, how we change those, how we change that mindset that Michael mentioned earlier. For all of us, this is a process of re-education. It's going to be a long process, hopefully not too long. We've got to step up the pace. But the whole planet, we're all together on this planet having to re-educate ourselves. And this evening, it's not ending. It's carrying on at the bar, the platform bar afterwards. So I hope you'll all join us. Thanks to you all for coming, for your questions, for your enthusiasm. And of course, thanks to our panelists.